So the title of this video is kind of a joke on my part, because before the 11th and 12th century, no one had ever thought of the Slavs as being very maritime oriented. This was due to the fact that for most of their early history, they didn't live near large bodies of water. In the north, the Baltic, Finno-Ugric and Norse tribes were near the sea. In the south, you had varying nomadic and Turkic groups like the Pechenegs or the Khazars, and in the Balkans, along the Adriatic coast, there were still the remnants of Rome in the form of Latin cities that controlled the seafaring lanes in that area, and it was in between all of that that the early Slavs lived, mostly landlocked. However, this is not to say that the early Slavs were completely incompetent when it came to sailing. After all, they had a lot of experience navigating the large waterways of Eastern Europe, from the Polesian marshes to the large Dnieper, Dniester, Bug, Vistula, Danube rivers and all of the tributaries around them. It is safe to say that the Slavs were well versed when it came to freshwater navigations. Plus, they most certainly picked up new sailing skills from their neighboring tribes, as attested to by the many foreign borrowed words in the Slavic language when it comes to sailing. There were even accounts of Slavs raiding Greek islands during the migration period, so they most certainly had the means for at least some sort of seafaring. But with all of that said, it would be hard not to mention the fact that early Slavs in general have always been a ground fighting force, with whatever sailing experience they had being used more for transport or trading than for military purposes. Therefore, the Avar siege of Constantinople in 626 is so interesting. You're probably asking right now, what do the Avars and their siege of a city have to do anything with a quote-unquote Slavic navy? But before we get to that, let's first introduce the background to this quite historic and kind of anticlimactic siege. The Avars have been in control of Pannonia since their conquest of the Gepids in 566/7 and the Lombard migration into Italy in 568. Ever since then, the Avar Khanate was a constant thorn in the Byzantine back, raiding into the Balkan Byzantine territory while also displacing a lot of people groups, mostly the Slavs, who moved towards the Balkans, causing more problems for the Byzantines. Not to mention the Avar exacting of payments from the Byzantines to stop many of these raids. The last of these payments before the siege of Constantinople was negotiated in 623 and consisted of 200,000 solidi, which was around 50,000 more solidi than what Attila the Hun negotiated with the Romans in 447. In fact, it was stated by Nicephorus that the payment was an amount never previously paid to the barbarians. So, considering that the Avars had this very lucrative 200,000 solidi peace deal with the Byzantines, it begs the question of why did they decide to attack Constantinople just 3 years later? Well, for that we have to turn to something that has been sometimes named the last war of antiquity, that is, the Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602 to 628. The Persians had seen much success during the first half of the war, mainly due to a power struggle within Byzantium. The Sasanians took over Syria, Egypt, Armenia, and parts of Anatolia. However, when the new and much famed Emperor Heraclius managed to finally consolidate power within Byzantium and install the Heraclian reforms, ending in 622, the tide of the war started to change. Heraclius negotiated the aforementioned 200,000 solidi peace deal with the Avars in 623 and turned all of his attention to the Persians. Now, against the entire might of the newly consolidated Byzantine Empire, the Persians were on the back foot, losing a couple of battles and parts of Anatolia and Armenia. Seeing the tide of war turn in the Byzantine favor, the last-ditch actions of the Persians seem to have been to ally themselves with the Avars and persuade them to break their peace treaty with the Byzantines. The Persians most likely promised the Avars all of the Byzantine Balkan provinces, as they themselves didn't care much for this area. The Avar Kagan, seeing this golden opportunity to gain more land, especially since most of the Byzantine forces were preoccupied fighting the Persians in the east, agreed to this alliance. What's interesting is that it seems like the Avar Khanate before the siege of Constantinople was going through some political turmoil. Since we have no written records from the Avars, it is hard to say what this political turmoil was, but it seems like the prestige-based rule of the Kagan, as present in all nomadic kingdoms, was getting challenged due to some reason, mostly by the Slavs and Bulgars. In fact, this may have been the reason why the Kagan agreed on breaking the truce and allying himself with the Persians, and why he decided on taking Constantinople right away instead of taking smaller cities in the Balkans first. The Kagan needed a big victory victory with a lot of booty to solidify his control among the many peoples in the Avar Khanate, and taking Constantinople would do that. Also, he probably didn't want to give much time for Heraclius to return with his army, and so went straight for Constantinople. The Avar preparations for the siege began in early 626. The Avar Khagan managed to assemble a formidable force, with a core of the army being formed by heavy Avar cavalry/infantry, which was supported by the Bulgar cavalry and infantry. The rest was light infantry, being mostly Slavic and Gepid. The Avar army arrived at Adrianople and waited there for at least a month, partaking in phony warfare with the Byzantines. This may have been either because the Avars were still waiting for parts of their army to show up, or they were waiting for the first fruits of the harvest to finish so they had enough supplies. Nevertheless, the vanguard of the Avar army crossed the Anastasian walls on the 29th of July, reaching the formidable Theodosian walls that same day. The Anastasian wall was built by Emperor Anastasian in the late 5th century, in order to prevent nomadic groups like the Avars from raiding the suburbs of Constantinople, but at this point the wall was kind of dilapidated and the Avar army had no problem crossing it. With most of the Byzantine army and the Emperor Heraclius campaigning in the east, Constantinople was pretty much left to defend itself. This was a momentous occasion. It was the first time in almost 250 years that Constantinople came under siege, and I would argue it was actually even longer than that because the Gothic siege of the city in 378 wasn't really a siege, but I digress. It was also the first time the formidable Theodosian triple-layered walls would be put to the test. Before we go further, it must be stated that all the accounts we have from the siege of Constantinople are from the Byzantine point of view, which means we end up with writings about the siege that look like this. The goal of war is in general the hope of booty, the removal of men, the seizure of goods. This is why the barbarian peoples begin a war. What other but our city would rightly be that which could be named infallibly and correctly in its totality the place of sacrifice of God, and one can see that it is generally speaking the only church which sings the glory and the anthem of God and the Virgin. Thus, we should interpret the word Gog from the Bible for the assembly of these people led against us by this mad dog the Khagan. Now the word Gog is taken from the Bible and it means an apocalyptic horde of barbarians of biblical proportions that the devout Christian Byzantines are defending against in the name of God and the Virgin Mary. Hence, Constantinople is seen by the Byzantines as this quote, place of sacrifice of God. So the sources we have almost unanimously present this narrative of a small pious force defending against this much larger barbaric pagan enemy. The problem with this view is that even though, yes, the numbers of the Avar army were most certainly much larger than the numbers of the Byzantine defenders, the Byzantines were defending probably at this point the most fortified city on earth with the Byzantine navy at their disposal. Plus, it's not like the nomadic peoples were well known for their siege ability, and the Avars with the Slavs in particular were already unable to take the much smaller fortified city of Thessaloniki just a couple of years prior. So this desperate narrative of the siege in our sources is at the very least quite exaggerated by the Byzantines. All this brings us back to the first day of the siege on the 29th of July as the Avar army is setting up in front of the triple-layered Theodosian walls. The first 2 days of the siege involved various diplomatic actions, plus psychological warfare. The Byzantines paraded upon their walls Christian relics, while the Avars held military parades. Both actions were supposed to encourage their own soldiers while scaring their enemies. The Avars during this time also started setting up siege towers, turtles, etc. Now, if you look at the map of Constantinople, you notice this body of water surrounding the city from the north. This is called the Golden Horn, and it provides a very good harbor and natural barrier for defending the city. However, since there already is this natural barrier, the fortifications on this side of the city were quite lackluster. It is still debated to what extent this area was fortified, but all historians agree, at the very least, it definitely wasn't as well fortified as the western Theodosian walls. Therefore, if Constantinople had a weak point, this was that weak point. And the Khagan obviously knew this because he brought with him a quote, navy. This Avar navy was manned by the Slavs. The Byzantines wrote that the Slavs brought with them over land dugout canoes, most likely being ordered to do so by the Khagan. Now, the word used by the Byzantines for the Slavic boats is monoxil, which mostly describes dugout canoes, but sometimes can mean more complex boats in Byzantine texts. Therefore, some historians try to say that the Slavs had actual battle-ready, well-constructed boats with masts, but considering the extent of Slavic naval experience, the fact that they brought the boats over land rather than sailing down the Black Sea, and that similar dugout canoes were used during the already mentioned unsuccessful siege of Thessaloniki, means that it is probably safe to say that these boats were normal dugout canoes that could have been slightly modified for siege warfare or even strung together for better sailing potential, but that's about it. On the third day of the siege, 31st of July, an all-out Avar assault happened across the entire Theodosian walls. The first wave of the attack was done by the quote, naked Slavs with ladders. This didn't do much damage, but after the defenders were weakened slightly, the heavy infantry replaced them. This first extensive Avar attack didn't go too well, but it wasn't supposed to. The Avars did not commit their siege weapons during this attack, and so it is most likely the Kagan just ordered this attack to probe the defenses of the city. On the fourth day of the siege, 1st of August, the day started with the Avar catapults pummeling the middle of the Theodosian walls. The defenders deployed their own catapults and were much more skilled in aiming them than the Avars, and so the battle of the catapults ended up being an Avar defeat. This did not matter to the Avars much, as they then brought out their siege towers that made their way to the walls. But even here, the Byzantines had a trick up their sleeves. One of the sailors created a weird long crane with a small boat at the end filled with flammable fluid. It is speculated that this fluid could have been the predecessor to Greek fire, but we don't know that for sure. Nevertheless, this contraption proved to be quite useful in destroying the siege towers, and the Avars were defeated in their attack once more. However, despite this defeat at the walls, the Avars did succeed somewhere else. While the Byzantines were busy defending the walls, the Slavs managed to launch all of their dugout canoes at the edge of the Golden Horn. Here they were protected from the Byzantine navy, as the water was too shallow for the Byzantine boats to engage the canoes effectively, and so the fourth day of the siege ended. On the fifth day of the siege, the Kagan stopped hostilities and sent out for a Byzantine embassy to meet him in front of the walls. When the embassy arrived, the Kagan showed them 3 Persian dignitaries who were there in support of the Kagan. The Kagan then said that the Persian army was waiting on the other side of the Bosphorus to assist the Avars in their siege. This wasn't the full Persian army, that one was preoccupied fighting Heraclius. No, this was just a contingent of soldiers sent around Heraclius' main force as to assist the Avars in their siege. This Persian army was actually on the other side of the Bosphorus since the start of the siege on the 29th of July, and the Byzantines were aware of them, but it was only now that the Kagan used this Persian army as a fear-mongering tactic, stating how many men he had and how certain it was Constantinople would fall. The Kagan told the embassy, "Leave me your city and property, for otherwise it is impossible for you to be saved, unless you become fish and depart by the sea, or birds and ascend to the sky." The Byzantines were not moved by these words, sarcastically retorting, "Although you have such great hordes, you still need Persian help." Seeing that the Byzantines would not surrender, the Kagan broke off the negotiations. The following night, the 3 Persian dignitaries crossing the Bosphorus back to the Persian army were caught by the Byzantine patrol boats. The Byzantines beheaded one of the Persians, then tied his head to the neck of the other Persian, whose hands they cut off, after which they sent him outside of the city walls back to the Kagan. The third dignitary was beheaded on a boat in the view of the Persian army on the other side of the Bosphorus. After that, the Byzantines threw the head to the Persians with an attached note saying, "The Kagan, after making terms with us, sent us the ambassadors who were dispatched to him by you. We have beheaded 2 of them in the city, while look, you have the head of the third one." The Persians did not fall for this trick, as on the night of the 6th day of the siege, the remaining Slavic canoes not in the Golden Horn made their way to the other side of the Bosphorus and picked up the Persian army. However, on the way back, they were ambushed by the much superior Byzantine navy, and most of them were killed. So ends the Persian chapter of the siege. On the 7th and 8th day of the siege, there were minor attacks here and there across the wall, but no major attack came. The only major development was that the Kagan moved to be positioned on the other side of the Golden Horn rather than in front of the main walls. It was obvious the Avars were planning something big, and so the 9th day of the siege rolled around. On this day, in early morning, an all-out attack was conducted by the Avar army across the entire wall. This attack only intensified as the day dragged on, and at some point in the day, the Kagan ordered the Slavic fleet, which was now bolstered by Bulgar infantry on board the canoes, to do a full-scale attack on the north side of the city. Here, the canoes met with the Byzantine navy across the entire Golden Horn, and a slugfest of fighting from boat to boat started. It did not take long for the Byzantines to gain the upper hand, and the entire quote Slavic navy was destroyed. Accounts say that the Golden Horn turned red from all the bloodshed. The few Slavs that managed to make it back ashore were reportedly killed by the Avars for losing the battle. Seeing that the fleet was defeated, the rest of the Slavs and Bulgars and other people fighting under the Avar banner started to withdraw from the city. It is reported that some of the Slavs fled into the local hills, presumably settling somewhere within the Balkans. Others went back home. The Kagan still stayed encamped outside of the city, but on the 10th day of the siege, even he withdrew, seeing that it was now impossible to take Constantinople with his entire fleet defeated. Byzantium won. They completely destroyed the prestige-based rule of the Kagan, and the Avar Khanate would never fully recover from this defeat. After the siege, the Avars had to deal with plethora of internal problems and rebellions. In the west with Samo, in the east with Kubrat, in the south with many Slavic warlords, with Lombard encroachment, and with the Byzantine efforts of retaking the Balkans. The Avars would eventually, after about 150 years, solidify their control in Pannonia once more, but they would never reach the height or power they enjoyed before the siege of Constantinople. So goes the story of the medieval Slavic navy, the first medieval siege of Constantinople, and the Avar decline of the 7th century. Thank you for watching this video. The Avar period is actually kind of my expertise, and even though this video isn't perfect, hopefully you enjoyed it. There's always corrections and more information in the pinned comment. I also know lately I have not been uploading much, but due to certain reasons it is just impossible to upload more, but it might change in the future, who knows. Anyways, if you support me on Patreon, much appreciated, and stick around for history.